The Subversive 50s, the second part. This is just the tail end of that lecture. A quick recap, the lecture is really about how about a 15-year period after the Second World War, we see some massive changes in U.S. society, changes that at the time weren't even completely recognized. But by the 60s, 70s, and even all the way up until now in the 2020s, we can still see the effects of these changes. And many of these changes we tend to assume happened, for instance, in the 60s and 70s, civil rights movement and women's movement, environmental movement. But in fact, it was all during this, what sometimes is seen as this boring, quiet, tame period of what we sometimes call the 50s. So that's why I call it the subversive 50s, what's really happening. And this painting you see in the background, this is a painting by Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock today is one of the most famous painters. In fact, his paintings now go for literally millions of dollars. He was considered part of, modern art. And, it's funny, people still love to make fun of modern art, even though, modern art has been around for literally a century now. But the classic line that people say is, "My 6-year-old can do this." Why do we like this art? And in this particular case, I mean, it really is just paint drippings. This is Jackson Pollock at work in the early 50s. But of course, in the era of photography and movies, and nowadays in 2020, with CGI and stuff, why does somebody need to paint something? We can take a photograph of it now. So that's where art evolved in the 20th century. It started to try to express emotion and feeling. And those are abstract feelings, so why, so to me, I happen to love Jackson Pollock. And people, always say, well, that's dumb. What is it? Well, it's like a design on wallpaper, or sometimes you walk into a room and the colors of the wall or the curtains just make you feel a certain way. There's nothing you can define about it. It's just the way it looks, the way a color makes you feel, the way a pattern on a dress can make a person feel. And it's like we recognize that, but somehow in a painting it's supposed to be perfect and exact. Anyway, the reason of Jackson Pollock, the reason I use him, is because it's not what we tend to think of as the 1950s. We tend to think of the 50s as, painters like Norman Rockwell, these very sweet, paintings that are of things that you could recognize, and we think of TV shows that are very simple and very plain. But again, just like in art, the 50s were this period where, this kind of rebellious stuff is going on. And Jackson Pollock was, as you can see, he's a middle-aged man, but yet he definitely represented that rebellious artist. He wore t-shirts and jeans, he smoked. In fact, his paintings, which are massive, he just slapped paint on, ashes from a cigarette would fall into the painting. If you ever get a chance to see one of these, I think the High Museum in Atlanta has one. They're almost 3D, these big, thick globules of paint, and you can see thumbprints and footprints in them and such. But he seemed to embody that kind of rebellious nature of the 50s that, again, sometimes gets forgotten about. So, another aspect of the 50s that we still see today, and that's the suburb. A suburb, a term that was coined in the late 40s. It means it's not urban, which means like a downtown area, which is where most people used to live. The majority of people would have lived, in downtown, in apartments and tenements and such. Or some people lived way out in the country on a farm. But starting in the late 40s, we start seeing a development of a new type of settlement. So they're not quite in the middle of downtown. In fact, people are beginning to leave the downtown areas, which is nowadays why many cities, you go to downtown Atlanta or downtown Boston or something. That's where all the poor people live, because all the people with money left downtown areas and went to what we now call the suburbs. Now here in Southwest Georgia, places like Bainbridge and Pelham and Tifton don't really have a whole lot of suburbs. But we do at the same time. If you think about most of these small towns, Where the people, the middle class people and the people with money, they tend to live a little further out. Maybe not out on a farm, but you know, in Bainbridge, you have areas like the Lake Douglas area. That would be, you know, basically a suburb, if you will, where the new neighborhoods are going in. And they tend to be planned communities, like you see here. This is Levittown in New Jersey, the very first of modern suburb. But these kind of, you know, planned communities where they're kind of closed off and, you know, they're all residential streets. And I mean, this is the kind of neighborhood I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida in the 70s and 80s. And if you think of most movies from the 70s, 80s, and later, I mean, they almost, same with TV shows, they almost always take place in a suburb. And even the shows in the 50s, like Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, I Love Lucy, Dick Van Dyke Show in the 60s, they all, Brady Bunch in the 60s, they all took place in a suburb. This is where the majority of Americans live. And on some level, they're wonderful. You have a home, you have a little yard, you have a little driveway, you have a backyard, you can put a pool in. I mean, this became, if you will, the American dream for most people. In other words, this is what people wanted. You know, when you have made it in society in America, this is what you had: a small home, a couple of kids, maybe a dog, a couple of televisions, a car or two, a nice little yard that you mow. By the way, as somebody who hates to mow their yard, this is when having a yard was a big deal. People didn't mow their yards before the 50s. Most people didn't have a yard. You had a farm or you lived in the middle of a downtown area in an apartment building. That's when everyone started to get a yard. Everybody started edging the yard and mowing the yard and getting a lawnmower. And, you know, again, modern life really began in the 50s. And this is still, I think, I bet most of you, your dream one day to get married, maybe not everybody, but get married, have some kids, buy a nice home, have a nice yard, and just live out the rest of your life. And this is when the American dream as we know it sort of began. However, as I've pointed out before, this was not the life for everybody. Some people are going to rebel against this life, but not only that, I mean, it was sort of a middle class white life. Most people of color, although we do see African American middle class growing, and we even see black suburbs growing in the 50s, the vast majority of, say, African Americans, Latin Americans, Asian Americans, were not able to live this life. In fact, a lot of these neighborhoods, like Levittown, were white exclusive. They didn't allow African Americans to buy property. Sometimes it was by rule, which will go away during the civil rights movement. But also some of this was also done kind of behind the scenes. There's been some recent studies of bank loans, housing loans, and showing that banks often just would refuse to give black families housing loans. So therefore, black families couldn't buy these types of homes and therefore couldn't join the suburbs and, you know, would remain poor, while white families would be approved for these bank loans, you know. So again, when we talk about institutional or systemic racism, it was a real thing. And, you know, so this was very much an American dream, but it was a white American dream. And it was a middle class white American dream. A lot of families, including my family, my parents couldn't afford to do this because they were too poor. So America wasn't perfect, of course, but it was changing, and we were beginning to see the wealth of the nation very much expand to many Americans. And then, of course, eventually it's going to expand to many more Americans. But for some people, this was not an American dream, it was an American nightmare. And some of this was a pushback against conformity, a pushback against sort of this idea that there's a one size fits all idea. And I think in particular in the 50s, during the time of the Cold War, there was a lot of pressure to look a certain way, to behave a certain way. And if you didn't, you were suspect. This novel, which is not very well known today, I don't think many of you probably have ever heard it. I know I didn't have to read it, for instance, in high school. But The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, which was also turned into a movie back in the 50s. The title refers to the fact that pretty much all men in the 50s, unless you were perhaps a farmer or a plumber, pretty much dressed the same way. You wore gray flannel suits. You had your little hat and your tie, your dress shoes. No matter what job you had, this is pretty much how you dressed. It was like a uniform almost. Again, the 50s is when we start to push back against that. Today, you go to most jobs and everybody looks different. Some have t-shirts and jeans, some are wearing dresses, some are wearing flannel shirts, some are wearing, dress suits. Sometimes you'll see somebody dressed like this, but in fact, you almost never see this anymore. And again, that's because of the 50s. There was a pushback of wanting to express your own individuality that, again, that doesn't really begin until the late 50s. So novels like The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit was the fact that many people didn't want to just live in a suburb and have 3 kids, drive to work every day. And the same way that women were pushing back against this idea of being a housewife, a lot of the men were like, I don't take pleasure in this. I don't want to do this. I don't have any individuality. And also, the 50s, there was a lot of push about things, getting all the best things in life will make you happy. And again, what's ironic is mental depression goes up in the 50s. This time of great, vast, growing wealth, there was growing depression and anxiety. Going to a psychiatrist went way up. Divorce, again, went up in the 50s. And because people were kind of forced into this idea. And a lot of people push back against this. A lot of famous novels from this time period, by novels like Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, one of my favorites growing up. I've noticed over the years most students aren't familiar with Catcher in the Rye anymore. I recommend it if you get a chance. Arthur Miller plays like Death of a Salesman. The Crucible were very much commenting on the 50s. Plays by people like Edward Albee, these plays that are kind of making fun of modern life. And again, today, I think we are much more, we can identify with this more than people in the 50s did. Another thing that's pushing back, Mad Magazine, again, 2019, it just stopped publishing. But when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, this was a magazine we all read. But I know it's not been a big magazine for 20, 30 years. But it started in the 50s, and Mad Magazine was basically this big, giant comic. The company EC Comics that made all those crime comics that I mentioned, they all went away because they were so controversial. But Mad Magazine stuck, and it was a magazine full of parodies of movies. It made fun of American life. It was really silly, but it was very sarcastic humor, very cutting humor, very dark humor. And Mad Magazine is a good symbol, I think, for where especially young America was heading by the late 50s. It's the beginning of something that becomes known as sick humor. This was a term that adults were using in the 1950s. When kids are young, and every generation does this, you make fun of things. Jokes that me and my friends made when I was in my teens, I would be embarrassed to admit today. But you make fun of, maybe you make religious jokes. You make sexual jokes. You make fun of your parents. You make fun of death. Very dark humor. And of course, that's normal. You're testing the boundaries of society and how far you can go. It's just like hearing teenagers talk. It's just every other word is a cuss word because for the first time they're using the words they're not supposed to use. And you're trying to push those boundaries. And it's sort of normal. It was just in the 50s. People started noticing it. And then for the first time, it started showing up in movies. It started showing up in music and humor. It started showing up in magazines like Mad Magazine. And at some point in the late 50s, people began to recognize this growing sense of sick humor. In fact, there was a Time magazine article warning parents about what's happening to their kids and the types of jokes they're cracking. In fact, I have a couple of examples of these sick humor. One of them is you see a kid, the joke is a kid and his dad are in a boat. And, actually, I'm not going to tell that one. I forgot being recorded, but I'll tell a slightly nicer one. These aren't very nice, though. When a kid asks his dad, "Daddy, why are we celebrating Christmas in July?" And he says, "Well, you're dying of cancer." Another one says, "Mommy, I hate my brother's guts. Shut up and eats what in front of you." Another one is Tom Lehrer, the guy you see here. Tom Lehrer was a song parodist. Kind of sounded like, I don't know if anybody knows Weird Al. He was kind of the Weird Al of his day. But he wrote songs that made fun of society, and some of his songs made fun of racism. In fact, I have an example in the links of one of his that's making fun of racism in the South. And in fact, it's almost like a musical version of my lecture on Jim Crow. Um, he also had a song called When You're Old and Gray, and the lyrics go, since I still appreciate you, let's find love while we may, because I'll hate you when you're old and gray. Your teeth will go down, your waist will start to spread. In 20 years or so, dear, I'll wish that you were dead. These are, today they're like whatever, but in the 50s, to make fun of people dying, to make fun of sickness, to make fun of cannibalism, I mean, these were seen as troubling. Are these future communists rising? Well, again, it's just kids being kids. It's just in the 50s there was this recognition. And I think it reached kind of higher levels, partly because there was such pressure to conform and to behave a certain way. The other image I have here is the Monster Mash, which was just kind of a silly song. Most of you have probably heard it. This was a #1 hit in 1958, and but kind of glorifying horrific ideas like Dracula and Frankenstein, which in the 30s were really, really scary. Now they're part of fun songs that kids sing about, and that was seen as troubling at one time. And again, I think we can recognize this in mainstream society today. Shows like South Park and Family Guy and Robot Chicken and tons and tons of YouTube videos and Facebook memes. Almost every time there's a tragedy, within 5 minutes, somebody's already created a meme of it. I mean, these are modern versions of the 50s sick humor. Yet today, kids do this, teens do this, parents. My grandfather, before he passed away, loved Family Guy. But in the 50s, when he was just a dad, he would have hated that as the downfall of America. And yet today, this is kind of we've mainstreamed what was at one time edgy in the 50s. What was seen as dangerous in the 50s is now part of mainstream American society. But one thing that, for instance, Tom Lehrer did in his song Dixie, which I have the example of, was doing the same thing that a comedian named Lenny Bruce did. And that was using humor to change society. I've always felt that that's one of the jobs of humor, was to push society. You punch up, you make fun of people in power, you make fun of awful things. So to the point that you ridicule it to the point that people no longer want to behave that way. Lenny Bruce, in fact, I have a very short clip of him making fun of race. In fact, it might be a good time to go ahead and listen to it very quickly. But what he's doing is making fun of racism. Tom Lehrer is doing the same thing. And if you can laugh at racism, then it makes it pretty easy to then turn around and get rid of racism. Make fun of segregation to the point that then you can get rid of it. Now, obviously, this is not humor that is politically correct. I mean, I think nowadays, I think sometimes people who are pushing back against political correctness, which I've always thought political correctness just meant just being polite. In fact, it comes from the same word. But this idea that you have to behave a certain way, you have to talk a certain way. I think that's one of the reasons why so many young people today are purposely anti-PC, because they're pushing back. They're doing the same thing that people in the 50s did. They're pushing back against these expectations. But Lenny Bruce is also the first comedian to really make humor political and truly transgressive. Transgressive means to push boundaries. You transgress boundaries, right? He was the first comedian to really use adult language, which every comedian does now. He was the first one to do that. In fact, he got, like the image here, he was constantly arrested for using profanity on stage, because he was pushing free speech. He said, I should be able to say whatever I want because it's free speech. He would purposely use race. He was a Jewish American who hated racism, but he purposely sometimes used racial language to show the ridiculousness of racism. And unfortunately, he ended up suffering from depression. He became a heroin addict and eventually died in the 60s. I'd say he was a tragic figure, but the legacy of Lenny Bruce, even though he's almost completely unknown to most people today, um, it's still felt in almost every major comedian today. We live in the world of Stephen Colbert's and John Oliver's and Louder with Crowder. I'm trying to not just do liberal here because but you think a lot of these YouTube videos. I mean, Gavin McGinnis and all these that are, uh, what's the one, the Joe one, the podcast. I forgot his name already. But all these people who are pushing boundaries against PC, against race, against politics, against whatever, they're all doing Lenny Bruce. Again, this rebellious nature of modern society started in the 50s with people like Lenny Bruce. Another example of pushing back against society, we see this in literature and poetry. People like Jack Kerouac. Again, somebody else. Now, in the 80s, we were into Jack Kerouac. When I was in high school, we all read Jack Kerouac. Again, I have found that most younger people are not familiar with this guy anymore. But Jack Kerouac was from New England. He was kind of your classic all-American kid, white, middle class. He was even literally the captain of his football team. But then, early 50s, he rebelled against all of that. He said, I'm not happy. I don't want to live this life. He started writing poetry. He wrote novels. He was into jazz music and really kind of created a new way of behaving and a new way of, again, pushing back against society. Now, a lot of what Jerry Kerouac did and his fellow writers did today, we can almost make fun of. It seems almost silly and corny, but it was literally rebellious in the 50s and revolutionary. Jack Kerouac's most famous novel is a novel called On the Road, which, again, as a teenager, I really used to identify with. And it's really about a couple of guys. It's clearly supposed to be Jack Kerouac and his friend, who just literally get on a car and just drive, and they're just experiencing life. Now, a lot of it is them getting drunk and going to Mexico and hanging out with prostitutes and doing horrible stuff that I do not recommend. But this idea of living the life you want to live, not the life you're supposed to live. Now, again, as a middle-aged man, who's a father and a husband and a professor, I'm like, no, you need a job and you have to live. But when you're young, yeah, I would agree with that. You should live the life you want to live within reason until you find who you are and before you settle down. And I think it is an appealing idea, and it was a revolutionary idea. And in fact, people like Jerry Kerouac said, we're the real individuals. We're the true Americans, not those men in the gray flannel suits. There's a passage On the Road that I think is very powerful, and so I'm going to read it out to you. He talks about meeting a young woman on in his travels and talking with her, and he describes her this way, quote, "She was dull. She spoke of evenings in the country making popcorn on the porch. Once this would have gladdened my heart, but because her heart was not glad when she said it, I knew there was nothing in it but the idea of what one should do. And what else do you do for fun? I asked. I tried to bring up boys and sex. Her great dark eyes surveyed me with emptiness and a kind of chagrin that reached back generations and generations in her blood from not having done what was crying out to be done, whatever it was. And everybody knows what it was. What do you want out of life? I asked. I wanted to take her. I wanted to wring it out of her. She didn't have the slightest idea what she wanted. She didn't know. She yawned. She was sleepy. It was too much. Nobody could tell. Nobody would ever tell. It was all over. She was 18 and lovely and lost." And in a way, as a professor who talks to students all the time, and I've had very similar conversations, not about boys and sex, but about what do you want to do with your life? What do you major in? What, and sometimes I ask students on the first day, what do you want to do? And, what's your major? And I can tell they're just given the majors that they've been told by their parents they should do. And there's nothing wrong with that if you're happy. But I actually kind of identify with this. I see so many young people that don't really know what they want. They're not reaching out for what they want. They're settling for what they think they're supposed to do. And if you're happy, fine. But I think so many people aren't happy. I think, the younger generation are using anti-anxiety medicines and antidepressants at record numbers. And maybe Jack Kerouac's got something here. Having said all that, Jack Kerouac unfortunately turned out to be a drug addict, an alcoholic, and died very miserably in the 60s as well. So maybe we shouldn't be listening to Jack Kerouac. But what his writings sort of sponsor was something known as the Beat generation. Beat referring to beatific, meaning to find bliss, to find happiness. And this inspired all these poets and writers and later musicians and painters. I mean, Jackson Pollock would have been almost considered a part of the Beat generation, even though he was a bit older than these guys. If you're a fan of the Beatles, this is where they get their name from. They were emulating the Beats, and that's why they called themselves the Beatles, spelled Beatles. And we can see the legacy of the Beats, again, being nonconformist, being alternative, uh, dressing the way you want to dress, talking the way you want to talk. In the 50s, it was flannel and jeans and smoking cigarettes and drinking cheap wine and driving around listening to jazz music. In the 60s, it would have been the hippies and rock and roll and long hair and flower shirts. In the 70s, it might have been punk music. In the 80s, it would have been breakdancing and rap music. By the 90s, it would have been grunge music. But every generation kind of finds their own identity, and they're all doing what the Beats did. Now, of course, very quickly, basically the Beats became juvenile delinquents, if you will. And the name against them became Beatnik. Beatnik was making fun of them as basically being a bunch of lazy communists. And so Sputnik was the Russian satellite, that first satellite into space, right? So the syllable Nick kind of got attached to anything you wanted to make fun of. So you Beatnik was basically saying you no good juvenile delinquent communist. So Beatnik is what most people tend to know these people as. And again, you've seen this image. Most people immediately went, hipster, which a hipster is sort of the derogatory term for somebody who tries to look a certain way and be a certain way, which is sort of the Beats of the 2000s to a degree, or a goth, or even people who embrace geek culture or cosplay or something. These are all in their own way doing what the Beats were doing in the 50s. So at first you may go, I don't have anything to identify with the Beats, but now you might go, oh, I play Dungeons and Dragons, or I play video games, or a big horror film fan, or, whatever you do that you just absolutely embrace, it's totally yours. Guess what? You're like the Beats. So again, we can see where 50s society is still alive today. And I think another example of, Southern rock in the 50s, which I think most people wouldn't think of having any connection with the Beats, exactly the same way. Confederate flags by the Civil Rights Movement were seen as negative. I personally don't like the Confederate flag. But also at the same time, I think if the moment you say you're not allowed to wear the Confederate flag, that's the first thing everybody wants to do. And think of bands like Leonard Skinner, the Allman Brothers, country musicians like Waylon Jennings or Willie Nelson, Johnny Cash, who purposely push back against what they were supposed to do. Oh, country music's supposed to look this way? We're going to grow beards and grow our hair out. We're going to be outlaw country, So again, we can see this beat impulse in so many different ways. So this is all the nonconformity of the 50s. This is another movement of the 50s that we still see today. Oh, I forgot about hip hop. Hip hop is another example of this. A lot of my examples have been very much kind of middle class white examples. I wanted to make sure we looked in some other directions, and you guys could probably come up with tons of other examples that, as an old man, I wouldn't be familiar with. Speaking of music, because it does seem to often, even the Beats were all about music and jazz, and Jack Kerouac, you're supposed to read him almost like you're rapping. There's a musicality to his writing. So I think it's time, let's talk about music a little bit. So in the South, and that's one thing I also wanted to mention, so much of this is coming out of the South. So this guy, a guy named Sam Phillips, he worked as a sound engineer and producer in a little studio up in Memphis, Tennessee, recording all kinds of music, mostly country music and what was sometimes just called black music, which basically would have been things like rhythm and blues or blues music, maybe gospel music. And he knew that some of this, country music was, some of it's very, good and very popular, but a lot of people wouldn't listen to it because it was seen as kind of hillbilly music. But then a lot of the rhythm and blues music, so that was considered black music, their audience was very limited. And he kept thinking, if I can not only bring these two musical forms together, which already they were quite similar, but if I could bring them together in sort of one performer, in particular, if that performer happened to be white, I could make $1 million. And so at his studios, that's Sun Studios, this little podunk little place in Memphis, a truck driver came in, and he wanted to record some music for his mother. And really, if you ever hear those recordings, they're awful. But Sam Phillips kind of went, there's something about this kid. So he said, "Hey kid, come back in a couple of days. I'm going to hire some a bassist and a guitarist, and I'm going to see if you're willing to record some other music." Okay. So they come in and they record a little bit. It's awful. It just doesn't sound right. So Sam Phillips is like, I just wasted my time. This isn't what I thought. And so while he was changing tape, he was going to do one more recording. Um, this guy and these two musicians just started improvising, and they started singing an old blues song called "It's All Right, Mama." And there's something about the rhythm of it and the style of it. And he was dancing while he was singing, and Sam just went, "Oh my God." That's exactly what he was looking for, that mix of Southern white and Southern black mixed together with rhythm. And he just said, "Stop, stop, stop." He said, "Wait." And he put the tape on. He said, "Do it again." And that song, "It's All Right, Mama," which I have linked, I want you to listen to it, because that recording created a new genre of music. And of course, it was, we're talking about Elvis Presley, the guy on the left here, this young truck driver uh, who grew up in an almost all black neighborhood, who was loved bluegrass music and loved jazz music, but he also loved rhythm and blues, and he loved black gospel, and he blended all of these influences together and created what becomes known as rock and roll. Which is kind of a blending of all these musical genres into one. And it's very, today it's very trendy to say, "Oh, Elvis, whatever, he was a racist that stole music from black people," which is not true at all. You may not like Elvis, but that is not true at all. In fact, he actually gave credit to black artists. In fact, the people who wrote songs like "It's All Right, Mama," or "You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog," they made tons of money off of it because they got royalty rights. He also promoted a lot of black artists. This is Elvis Presley standing with B.B. King, who elevated, to the mainstream, because basically what Elvis did is he made it okay for white kids, the kids with all the money, white kids, to listen to black music. So he was the gateway. So if you start with Elvis. Oh, by the way, before I even finish, this is such a revolutionary image. This is a photograph of taken of these two guys, Elvis and B.B. King, in Memphis in 1955, the same year that Emmett Till was brutally murdered for whistling at a white woman. And here are two young men of two different races with their arms around each other, and it was not seen as wrong because music brought them together. I am one of those historians that really believes that rock and roll truly changed American society, because for the first time, white kids are listening to the music of black artists and idolizing black artists, and vice versa. So suddenly you start seeing not just people like Jerry Lee Lewis and Johnny Cash and Elvis Presley, but you also start seeing people like Little Richard and Chuck Berry. And what's really interesting, a lot of this music was actually quite transgressive. It was very sexual. I mean, when Jerry Lee Lewis sang "Great Balls of Fire," he's literally singing about great balls of fire. And when Little Richard is singing, "Golly Miss Molly" or "Tutti Frutti," and he's screaming. In fact, I have links to all of these songs, and screaming during the song. I mean, it's all about sex. It's all about, doing what you're not supposed to do. I mean, this was transgressive, dangerous music. And it was rebellious, and teens loved it. So this tied in with the sick humor and Lenny Bruce and the beats. Now, by the late 50s into the 60s, things kind of calm down. We start getting what we call deracinated. That means to take the race out. Bubblegum pop. So Elvis gets drafted to the military. Jerry Lee Lewis gets arrested. Chuck Berry gets arrested. Little Richard becomes very religious. And so music in the late 50s gets very tame. And it wouldn't be until the 60s with the Beatles and the quote unquote hippie music that rock kind of goes dangerous again. But it all started in the mid 50s with people like Elvis and Little Richard and Chuck Berry. All right. Um, so the civil rights movement also begins in the late 40s and in the 50s. And we're going to have a whole lecture on that. But we can see, again, coming right out of World War II. World War II was us fighting the Nazis, fighting the Japanese, fighting the fascists in Italy, people who based their entire existence on their own racial superiority. And of course, that goes against American ideas of all men are created equal, but yet we had lynchings here. We had racial violence here. We had white superiority here. So as we were fighting the Nazis and the Japanese and the fascists, we began to say, hey, shouldn't we also be fighting Jim Crow? Because isn't segregation the same basic idea? And of course it was. So there was a big push for double victory, especially in the black communities. We're going to fight fascism, Japan, Italy, Germany, the Nazis, but we're also going to fight segregation. So the modern civil rights movement had its seeds in World War II. People like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X grew up. They were kids during World War II. So when they were adults in the 50s, they remember, like, yes, we're going to end segregation in America. But I have a whole lecture on that. In fact, that'll be our last lecture. The other one, of course, is the Cold War. I think most of you probably have already listened to that before you did this lecture. But the Cold War is the other long-term effects of World War II. Things like the arms race, the fear of communism, which we call McCarthyism in the 50s. All of that also has its origins in the long-term effects of World War II. All right, that's it. Barely 30 minutes, so probably my shortest lecture. Of course, that's after an hour and a half lecture of part one. But anyway, thank you guys. I appreciate it.